Imagine this. One afternoon, you voice a different opinion than your husband, your pastor, or the local authorities. And by the next morning, you wake up strapped to an iron bed, surrounded by screams, with no access to a lawyer. In the 19th century, this wasn't a nightmare. It was a very real possibility. At the time, mental asylums were presented as medical institutions. In practice, however, they often functioned as tools of social control. The poor, the inconvenient, and the defenseless. Anyone without someone powerful to speak on their behalf could easily find themselves locked away. And behind it all was a simple economic incentive. The state paid institutions per patient. The more heads they housed, the more funding they received, and the longer those patients remained confined, the more profitable the arrangement became. In a system like this, insanity was not always diagnosed. More often than not, it was decided. Committing someone didn't require extensive evidence or a thorough investigation. A brief examination and the signatures of 2 doctors were often enough. Hundreds of perfectly sane people ended up in these institutions for reasons as trivial as sadness, fatigue, or simply being solitary by nature. Once inside, getting out was nearly impossible. With no meaningful oversight, administrators had little incentive to cure, only to keep patients confined. To maximize profits, they hired poorly trained staff willing to work for low wages, regardless of how they treated those in their care. Abuse and neglect were brushed aside as long as costs stayed down. Cutting expenses to the bare minimum was the real business model. And yet some people survived this nightmare and chose to speak out. Today, we'll look at the stories of those who forced the system to confront itself. The first case we'll explore became one of the most famous investigations in the history of journalism. In 1887, a young reporter made a radical decision to uncover the truth. She pretended to be insane so she could be committed. Her name was Nellie Bly, and she worked for the New York World. Bly feigned confusion and fear during a medical evaluation. Within hours, she was declared insane and sent to the asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York City. What she found there far exceeded anything she had imagined. Patients forced to bathe in freezing water in the middle of winter. Rotten, inadequate food. Women beaten and tied to chairs for hours simply for complaining. It quickly became clear to her that there was no real treatment, only punishment. Bly discovered that many of the women confined there were perfectly sane. Immigrants who didn't speak English, or poor widows who had become inconvenient to society. Her most chilling conclusion was this: confinement itself had the power to break healthy minds and truly drive people insane. For the next several days, Bly continued to play her role, watching, listening, memorizing every detail. She knew that if she forgot anything, no one else would tell the story. After 10 days, her editor secured her release. She exposed the inhumane conditions at Blackwell's Island in her investigation, later published as 10 Days in a Madhouse. The impact was immediate. Official investigations followed, staff were dismissed, and for the first time there was a meaningful increase in funding for mental health care. It became a foundational moment in the push to reform psychiatric institutions across the Western world. Our next case is that of Elizabeth Packard. She was not a journalist, nor did she enter an asylum by choice. She was committed by her own husband. In 1860, Elizabeth was institutionalized for disagreeing with the religious views of her husband, the Calvinist minister Theophilus Packard. She challenged his strict interpretation of Calvinism and defended more liberal theological ideas, including the belief in a benevolent God. There was no evidence of mental illness, only a woman asserting her intellectual independence. But Reverend Packard invoked a law that allowed husbands to commit their wives without a trial. She spent years confined despite being entirely sane. It took 3 years for her to regain her freedom in 1863, and only because her eldest son reached legal adulthood and assumed guardianship over his mother. But her fight was just beginning. After her release, Elizabeth Packard became a force of nature, leading one of the most influential protest movements and reform campaigns of 19th century America. In 1864, she brought a landmark case against the state to have her sanity legally affirmed, the only way to nullify the authority her husband still held over her. Anticipating defeat, Reverend Packard fled before the hearing, leaving Illinois for Massachusetts. He took their younger children with him, along with Elizabeth's money and even her clothing, leaving her homeless and destitute. Even so, the jury needed only 7 minutes to declare her sane. She went on to publish best-selling books, and with the proceeds she launched an uncompromising campaign against the system. First, she traveled across the country advocating for legislative reform, helping secure changes to more than 30 bills, measures that became informally known as the Packard laws. Her greatest victory was guaranteeing that any person had the right to a jury trial before being committed to a mental institution. She also helped secure major postal and property reforms. Congress granted institutionalized patients the right to send mail without censorship by asylum authorities, making it far harder to conceal abuse behind closed doors. Finally, she fought for property rights for married women, ensuring they could control their own wages and assets, a right she herself had lost when her husband sold her belongings during her confinement. Elizabeth Packard exposed how asylums were being used as a legal weapon to dispose of undesirable individuals. By the end of her life, she was a successful author and a national figure. Her husband, by contrast, died isolated and impoverished. In a final act of dignity, Elizabeth used part of her earnings to provide financial support to the man who had once tried to erase her from the world. But Elizabeth's struggle would need an heir in the 20th century, someone who could speak the language of elites, finish tearing down the walls. If Nellie Bly was the volunteer infiltrator and Elizabeth Packard the prisoner of conscience, our third case, Clifford Beers was the man who set out to dismantle the system from within. In 1900, this brilliant graduate of Yale University suffered a mental breakdown after the death of his brother. He attempted suicide by jumping from a fourth-story window. He survived and was committed to a series of asylums for the next 3 years. There, Beers endured firsthand what Elizabeth Packard had denounced decades earlier: beatings, isolation cells, and the routine use of straitjackets. He made a vow to himself. If he ever regained his freedom, he would become a commissioner for the insane. After years of rebellion, hunger strikes, and confrontations with guards, Beers realized he was unlikely to be released anytime soon. Eventually, he understood a crucial truth. If he wanted to destroy the system, he first had to survive it. So he did something extraordinary. While still confined, he became a kind of spy. He began feigning complete calm to win the trust of his keepers, and in secret he started documenting the abuses in meticulous detail. He managed to bypass hospital censorship and sent a 30-page letter to his brother, written with such clarity and rational precision that it became increasingly difficult for authorities to maintain that he was insane. Thanks in part to his brother William's influence and his connections at Yale, pressure mounted on the hospital's administrators. Fearing legal scandal and faced with clear evidence that Beers' intellectual faculties were intact, the doctors relented. In September 1903, the doors finally opened. Beers walked out with a bundle of hidden notes under his clothes. Those notes became a book that would reshape modern psychiatry. A Mind That Found Itself. Unlike many accounts of the era, his work was not a mere cry for help. It was a strategic blueprint for reform. With the analytical clarity of a scholar and the support of the legendary psychologist William James Beers, argued that mental illness was neither a moral failing nor a spectacle, but a medical condition from which people could recover with dignity. His charisma achieved something remarkable. He brought scientists and industrial magnates, including members of the Rockefeller family, to the same table, persuading them that mental health was the great frontier of the 20th century. He spoke to millionaires in the language they understood. He demonstrated that the asylum system was financially wasteful. He argued that prevention and early treatment would keep thousands from becoming long-term public burdens. Mental health ceased to be framed as charity and began to be seen as a matter of national productivity. In 1909, Beers used the royalties from his book and his Yale connections to found the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in LA. He convinced philanthropists such as Henry Phipps Jr. to donate substantial sums. With that funding, he hired leading psychiatrists to conduct rigorous scientific studies. helped move mental health out of basement wards and into universities as a serious academic priority. Perhaps most revolutionary was his honesty. He described his own delusions, such as believing his deceased brother was sending him messages, with such detail and self-awareness that readers came to understand mental illness not as a loss of humanity, but as a condition one could return from. Yet his most poetic victory may have been the creation of the mental health bell, often associated with the symbol of the mental health America. In the early 1950s, leaders of the movement sought a powerful emblem of hope and liberation from the dark past of the asylum era. Psychiatric hospitals across the United States were asked to send in obsolete restraints. Tons of chains, shackles, handcuffs, and iron bars, once used to bind patients to walls and beds, were collected and melted down. From that metal, a bell was cast. The material that once symbolized suffering and confinement was transformed into a sound of freedom. In many films and television series, when a patient is discharged from a psychiatric hospital, they ring a bell, a symbolic gesture of recovery and hope for those still inside. The bell bears an inscription that captures the spirit of the reformers whose stories we've explored. Cast off the shackles of yesterday. In ancient times, chains and shackles were used to restrain people with mental illness. Today, we ring this bell in hope that the chains of mental illness will be broken. And yet, Clifford Beers' story ends on a bittersweet note. The man who helped open the doors of asylums to public scrutiny spent his final years seeking refuge in one, struggling once more with his own inner darkness until his death in 1943. He died believing he had failed, never fully knowing that every time someone today receives humane treatment in a mental health facility, it traces back in part to that young Yale graduate who shook the world with his book and his resolve. 3 names, 3 eras, one shared struggle. Nellie Bly showed the world that the system was, in many ways, a theater of cruelty. Elizabeth Packard reminded us that no one, not a husband, not a pastor, has the right to imprison another person for their thoughts. And Clifford Beers proved that even from the deepest abyss, it is possible to build a ladder back toward the light. Today, mental health is no longer treated as a sideshow spectacle or a business built on locked cells, but as a fundamental human right. These 3 courageous figures did more than survive the asylum. They forced it to change, clearing the way for something more humane. Because as chains are melted down and recast into bells, the cry for freedom first raised by Bly, Packard, and Beers continues to echo in every person who now receives fair, dignified care. If you're passionate about hidden history and surprising facts, make sure to subscribe for more reports like this. I'm Alejandro Padilla, and I'll see you next time.